My beloved child. There is something unusual about this moment, and if you listen carefully, you may begin to understand why certain feelings have been quietly surrounding you lately. Not loudly. Not dramatically. Just beneath the surface, like a gentle current moving through water long before anyone notices the tide has changed. Somewhere, beyond what you can currently see, conversations have been unfolding. Names have been spoken. Questions have been asked. And strangely enough, your name has been resting in the center of those conversations more often than you realize. What makes this different is not that people were talking about you. People talk every day. Opinions rise and fall like leaves in the wind. No, what makes this moment different is the atmosphere surrounding those discussions. It was not casual. It was not rushed. It carried a weight that surprised even the people sitting in the room. Imagine a quiet evening. The kind where everyone arrives carrying thoughts they have not fully shared before. One person speaks first. Another listens. Someone else remains silent, observing every detail. What begins as a simple conversation slowly becomes something deeper. Not because they planned it that way, but because every path somehow keeps leading back to you. And here is what nobody expected. The more they spoke, the less certain they became about the picture they once held. Pieces that seemed clear suddenly felt incomplete. Assumptions that had survived for months no longer felt solid. It was as though they were looking at a story they thought they understood, only to realize entire chapters had been missing. Don't skip. Something important is waiting for you. Because this was not the kind of meeting where people gathered to repeat old conclusions. It became something entirely different. Every question seemed to uncover another layer. Every layer revealed another truth. And with each passing moment, the room grew quieter. Have you ever noticed how the strongest realizations rarely arrive with noise? They arrive with silence. A pause. A glance across the room. A moment when someone suddenly sees what was there all along. That is exactly what began to happen. One person remembered something they had overlooked. Another recalled a detail that no longer matched the story they had been telling themselves. Little by little, perspectives started shifting. Not dramatically. Not all at once. But enough that nobody could ignore it. And while this was happening, your soulmate remained unaware of how deeply these conversations were evolving. That may be the most surprising part. The meeting was supposed to clarify things. Instead, it opened doors nobody expected to open. There was a moment when the room became completely still. Not because anyone had reached a final answer. Because someone asked a question. A simple question. Yet it changed the direction of everything. The question was not about what others believed. It was about who you truly are beneath the assumptions, beneath the distance, beneath the stories people create when they only see fragments of a person. And suddenly the discussion became much more personal. Much more real. The room was no longer examining an idea. They were examining a human heart. Your heart. Stay till the end. Because what happened next was something nobody anticipated. The conversation began moving away from appearances and toward meaning. Away from uncertainty and toward understanding. People who entered the meeting carrying one perspective found themselves listening more carefully than before. Some spoke less. Some listened more. And in that quiet exchange, something unexpected started taking shape. Not a judgment. Not a rejection. Not even a decision. Something else. Recognition. The kind that arrives when people finally see beyond the surface. And although nobody knew it yet, that recognition was slowly guiding the meeting toward a conclusion that would surprise everyone involved. Especially your soulmate. Because while these discussions continued behind closed doors, another realization was unfolding at the very same time. A realization connected directly to you. A realization that would eventually force everyone in that room to reconsider what they thought they knew. But that part of the story had not revealed itself yet. Not fully. Not tonight. For now, all anyone could feel was the growing sense that something meaningful was approaching. Something that had been quietly building for much longer than anyone realized. And as the meeting continued, one final voice prepared to speak. A voice that had remained silent until this very moment. A voice carrying information capable of changing the entire direction of the conversation. And when that person finally began to speak, every eye in the room turned toward them. Because somehow, deep down, everyone sensed the same thing. The real turning point had just arrived. A single sentence can sometimes carry more weight than an entire evening of conversation, and the moment that quiet voice finally began to speak, the atmosphere inside that room shifted in a way nobody could ignore. The interesting thing was not how loudly they spoke. It was how carefully everyone listened. Even those who had been confident in their opinions found themselves leaning forward, waiting to hear what had remained unspoken for so long. There was no rush. No interruption. Just a growing awareness that something meaningful was about to emerge from the silence. The voice began not with conclusions, but with observations. Small details. Moments that others had overlooked. Kindness that had gone unnoticed. Patience that had never been acknowledged. Choices you made when nobody was watching. The room had spent so much time discussing possibilities that they had almost forgotten the evidence already sitting in front of them. And that is when something remarkable started happening. The image they carried of you began changing. Not because anyone was trying to persuade them. Because the truth has a way of standing quietly on its own. One memory led to another. One story unlocked another story. Before long, people who had entered the meeting with uncertainty were sharing moments that revealed a very different picture than the one they had expected to discuss. Someone remembered how you handled a difficult situation with grace. Someone else remembered your loyalty. Another recalled the way you brought calm into a moment that could have easily become complicated. Piece by piece, the conversation transformed. What had started as an evaluation slowly became an appreciation. And perhaps the most surprising part was this. Nobody planned for it to happen. Sometimes understanding arrives when people stop trying to control where the conversation is going. Sometimes the most important truths reveal themselves naturally. Don't skip. Because the next realization caught everyone off guard. As these memories continued surfacing, a question emerged that nobody had considered before. What if the person they had been trying to understand was even stronger than they realized? The room grew thoughtful. Not silent this time. Thoughtful. There is a difference. Silence can come from uncertainty. Thoughtfulness comes from discovery. And discovery was filling every corner of that meeting. The conversation was no longer focused on whether you belonged in your soulmate's future. It was beginning to focus on something entirely different. What role you might already be playing in that future without even knowing it. That idea lingered in the air. Nobody dismissed it. Nobody rushed past it. Because the more they examined it, the more sense it seemed to make. Have you ever looked back on your life and realized that certain moments only became meaningful later? At the time they seemed ordinary. Then suddenly everything connected. That is exactly what started happening in that room. Past events were being viewed through a new lens. Comments that once seemed insignificant now carried meaning. Small encounters suddenly appeared important. Even the timing of certain things felt impossible to ignore. And somewhere in the middle of all this, your soulmate's name was mentioned again. This time differently. Not with hesitation. Not with concern. But with curiosity. A deep curiosity about what might happen if certain walls were finally allowed to come down. Stay till the end. Because something important is waiting for you. The meeting had now entered a stage nobody anticipated. People were no longer debating possibilities. They were imagining outcomes. The energy had changed completely. Yet one person remained unconvinced. Not because they disagreed. Because they believed there was still one missing piece. One answer nobody had found. One perspective nobody had heard. And when they finally explained what they meant, the entire room paused once more. Their question was simple. What does your soulmate truly feel? For the first time all evening, nobody immediately answered. Not because the answer was unknown. Because everyone realized they had spent hours discussing circumstances while avoiding the most important subject of all. The heart. What was actually happening inside your soulmate's heart? The question lingered. The room became still. And then someone quietly revealed something they had recently noticed. A change. A subtle one. But impossible to miss once it was spoken aloud. The way your soulmate reacted whenever your name appeared. The way their expression shifted. The way they seemed distracted afterward. The way certain conversations always circled back to you. The room listened carefully. And for the first time that evening, a completely new understanding began taking shape. One that had nothing to do with assumptions. Nothing to do with speculation. Everything to do with genuine feeling. A feeling that had been growing much longer than anyone realized. And as that realization settled into the hearts of everyone present, the meeting moved closer than ever to its final decision. But before that decision could be spoken, one unexpected detail surfaced. A detail connected directly to something your soulmate had recently said when they thought nobody was paying attention. The moment those words were repeated inside the room, everything changed. And suddenly, the decision everyone thought they were about to make no longer seemed certain at all. Nobody expected those forgotten words to carry so much weight. The moment they were repeated, the room seemed to lose track of time. Conversations that had been moving confidently in one direction suddenly slowed. Not because anyone disagreed with what was said, but because the meaning behind those words reached deeper than anyone anticipated. What made them so powerful was their simplicity. There had been no grand speech. No dramatic declaration. Just a quiet moment when your soulmate believed nobody was paying attention. Yet sometimes the most honest things people say are spoken when they are not trying to convince anyone. Those are the words that come directly from the heart. And according to the person sharing the story, your soulmate had mentioned your name with a softness that was impossible to ignore. Not once. More than once. Not accidentally. Consistently. As though your presence continued appearing in their thoughts no matter how hard they tried to focus elsewhere. The room listened carefully. And for the first time that evening, nobody interrupted. Nobody challenged the observation. Because deep down, everyone recognized something important. Feelings can be hidden. But patterns rarely lie. Stay a little longer. Because this is where everything begins to connect. The meeting had started with questions about you. Now the questions were slowly turning toward your soulmate. When did these feelings become this strong? How long had they been growing? Why had nobody noticed sooner? The answers did not arrive immediately. Instead, they emerged through small memories. One person remembered a conversation from months ago. Another remembered a reaction that seemed insignificant at the time. Someone else recalled a moment when your soulmate suddenly became unusually quiet after hearing news connected to you. Individually, these moments meant very little. Together, they painted a picture nobody could ignore. And with every new memory, the atmosphere changed again. Not dramatically. Not suddenly. But steadily. Like sunlight slowly filling a room before anyone realizes dawn has arrived. What surprised everyone most was how natural it felt. There was no sense of forcing a conclusion. No sense of trying to create a story. The story was already there. People were simply seeing it clearly for the first time. Don't skip. Something important is waiting for you. Because while these realizations were unfolding, another unexpected detail emerged. A detail that shifted the meeting even further. Someone asked a question nobody had considered. What if this connection has already changed both of them more than they realize? The room became thoughtful once again. That question lingered. Not because it was difficult. Because it felt true. Think about it. Certain people enter our lives and leave obvious footprints. Others create quieter changes. Changes that reveal themselves gradually. A new perspective. A stronger sense of purpose. A deeper understanding of what matters. The people in that room began reflecting on how your soulmate had evolved over time. And strangely enough, many of those changes seemed connected to the period after you entered their world. Patience where there had once been frustration. Hope where there had once been uncertainty. A willingness to believe in possibilities that previously seemed distant. The more they reflected, the more difficult it became to dismiss what was unfolding before them. Because this was no longer about whether you mattered. That question had already been answered. The real question was becoming something much bigger. What should happen next? And that is when the meeting entered its most important phase. The phase where opinions stop looking backward and start looking forward. The room grew quiet again. Not from uncertainty this time. From anticipation. Everyone knew a decision was approaching. Everyone could feel it. Yet before anyone spoke, one final perspective emerged. A perspective from someone who had remained mostly silent throughout the evening. When they finally began talking, the room listened with complete attention. Because this person was known for speaking only when they truly had something meaningful to say. And what they said changed everything. They did not talk about circumstances. They did not talk about timing. They did not talk about obstacles. Instead, they spoke about character. About integrity. About consistency. About the kind of qualities that remain visible long after excitement fades. Then, after a long pause, they shared a realization that settled over the room like a calm wave. They said that some people spend years searching for someone who brings peace, understanding, and authenticity into their lives. And when that kind of person appears, it should never be taken lightly. The room fell silent. Not because anyone disagreed. Because everyone understood exactly what was being implied. For the first time all evening, nobody seemed focused on what could go wrong. They were focused on what could go right. And that shift changed the energy completely. Stay till the end. Because the final decision was now closer than ever. The conversation that followed felt different from everything that came before it. Lighter. Clearer. More certain. The confusion that had filled the beginning of the meeting seemed far away now. In its place was something much stronger. Understanding. And as everyone prepared to share their final thoughts, one person noticed something that nobody else had considered. A detail so unexpected that it immediately captured the attention of the entire room. It was connected to a recent event. A recent conversation. A recent choice your soulmate had made. At first, it seemed unrelated. But once the connection became clear, every person sitting there realized the same thing at the exact same moment. The decision they were about to make might already have been quietly made by your soulmate's heart long before this meeting ever began. And when that realization finally settled into the room, nobody knew quite what to say next. Because if that was true, then the most surprising part of this story was still waiting to be revealed. There are moments when an entire conversation changes because of a single realization, and this was one of those moments. The room had spent hours examining possibilities, sharing memories, and weighing perspectives, yet now they found themselves facing something much simpler and much more powerful. What if the answer they had been searching for was never hidden at all? What if it had been quietly visible through your soulmate's actions the entire time? The thought settled over everyone like a gentle silence. Nobody rushed to speak. Nobody tried to argue. Because the more they reflected, the more they began noticing something they had previously overlooked. Your soulmate's choices. Not their words. Not their hopes. Their choices. After all, words can sometimes be uncertain. Emotions can fluctuate. But choices reveal direction. Choices reveal what truly matters. And when the people in that room started connecting those choices together, a pattern began emerging that was impossible to ignore. A surprising pattern. A meaningful pattern. A pattern that somehow kept leading back to you. Stay a little longer. Because something important is waiting for you. One person pointed out how your soulmate had repeatedly protected certain conversations whenever your name came up. Another remembered moments when opportunities to move on had appeared, yet somehow those opportunities never seemed to capture their heart. Someone else recalled how your soulmate always seemed more hopeful after hearing even the smallest update connected to you. These were not dramatic events. That was what made them so powerful. They were genuine, natural, consistent. The kind of details people only recognize when they step back and look at the bigger picture. And suddenly the room wasn't discussing possibilities anymore. They were witnessing a story that had already been unfolding. A story nobody had fully understood until now. Have you ever noticed how certain truths take time to become visible? Not because they are hidden. Because people are not ready to see them yet. That seemed to be exactly what was happening here. The meeting had started with uncertainty. Now uncertainty was disappearing. Not all at once. Slowly. Gracefully. Like fog lifting from a landscape that had been there all along. The more clearly everyone could see, the more remarkable the picture became. Because this was no longer simply about whether you were important to your soulmate. That question had long since been answered. The deeper realization was something else entirely. You had become part of the future they quietly imagined. Not through pressure. Not through expectation. But through genuine feeling. And that realization changed the atmosphere in the room once again. Don't skip. Because what happened next surprised even the people who thought they understood everything. One by one, final thoughts began to be shared. The conversation no longer felt heavy. It felt hopeful. The kind of hope that appears when people finally stop looking for reasons something cannot work and begin noticing all the reasons it can. A warmth entered the discussion. Not excitement. Something deeper. Confidence. The quiet confidence that grows when understanding replaces confusion. Then someone spoke words that nobody forgot. They said that sometimes life places certain people on our path not to complicate our journey, but to help us become more ourselves. The room became still. Not because the statement was dramatic. Because it felt true. And as those words lingered in the air, more than one person realized they had been looking at this situation from the wrong angle all along. Instead of asking what challenges existed, they began asking what possibilities existed. Instead of focusing on uncertainty, they focused on growth. Instead of imagining distance, they imagined connection. And for the first time all evening, it seemed as though everyone was beginning to move toward the same conclusion. A conclusion that felt surprisingly natural. Almost inevitable. Yet before anyone could formally express that conclusion, something unexpected happened. A message. Not a dramatic message. Not a shocking message. A simple message. Something recent. Something your soulmate had said to someone they trusted. The person sharing it hesitated before repeating it. Not because it was secret. Because of how sincere it sounded. The room listened carefully. Every eye turned toward them. Every thought seemed to pause. Then the words were finally spoken. The message wasn't about fear. It wasn't about confusion. It wasn't about doubt. It was about appreciation. About respect. About seeing qualities in someone that are becoming harder and harder to ignore. And when your name appeared within that message, everything became clear. The room understood something in that instant. Something that had been building throughout the entire evening. The feelings being discussed were not temporary. They were not passing emotions. They had roots. Deep roots. The kind that grow quietly beneath the surface long before anyone notices the strength they have developed. Stay till the end. Because the final decision was now closer than it had ever been. The discussion that followed felt different from everything that came before. People were no longer trying to determine what they thought. They already knew. What remained was deciding how to express it. How to put into words what everyone had gradually come to understand. And as they prepared to do exactly that, one final observation emerged. A realization so simple that it left the entire room silent once more. Someone pointed out that throughout the entire meeting, every positive possibility seemed to create peace, while every attempt to imagine moving away from this connection created hesitation. That observation changed everything. Because suddenly the answer felt obvious. Not forced. Not dramatic. Obvious. The room exchanged quiet glances. A few smiles appeared. Several people nodded. And for the first time since the meeting began, there was a sense that everyone had arrived at the same destination. The final decision was only moments away from being spoken aloud. But just before those words were shared, one person asked a final question. A question that nobody expected. A question so meaningful that it caused everyone to pause one last time. Because the answer to that question would determine not only what the final decision would be, but why it would matter far more than anyone had originally imagined. The question arrived so gently that, at first, it almost seemed ordinary. Yet the moment it was spoken, every conversation in the room seemed to stop. Because it was not a question about circumstances. It was not a question about timing. It was not even a question about the future. It was a question about the heart. The person quietly asked, "What kind of person does your soulmate become when they talk about them?" No one answered immediately. Not because they lacked an answer. Because everyone suddenly realized they had one. The room became still as memory after memory surfaced. They remembered the difference in your soulmate's voice. The change in their energy. The way they seemed lighter after certain conversations. The way hope appeared when your name entered the room. And perhaps most importantly, the way they seemed more like themselves. Not a different person. A truer version of themselves. That realization carried a quiet power. Because sometimes the value of a connection is not measured by excitement. Sometimes it is measured by authenticity. By how free someone feels to be who they truly are. And as that understanding settled over everyone, the final pieces of the puzzle began falling into place. Stay a little longer. Because something important is waiting for you. The meeting had now become something nobody expected. What began as a discussion had transformed into a discovery. Not a discovery about you alone. Not a discovery about your soulmate alone. A discovery about what happens when two paths influence each other in meaningful ways. The people gathered there began reflecting on everything they had shared. The stories. The observations. The moments they almost overlooked. And the more they reflected, the more one truth became impossible to ignore. You were not simply someone being talked about. You had become someone who mattered. Deeply. Genuinely. Consistently. The room could feel it. And strangely enough, the realization brought peace rather than uncertainty. The kind of peace that arrives when confusion finally gives way to clarity. One person smiled. Another nodded. Someone quietly looked down at the table and laughed softly, as though they had finally understood something that should have been obvious all along. The atmosphere was completely different now. The tension that existed at the beginning of the evening had disappeared. In its place was understanding. And understanding has a unique way of changing everything without raising its voice. Don't skip. Because this next moment became one of the most memorable parts of the entire meeting. A family member who had spoken very little all evening finally decided to share their perspective. Everyone listened. Because when someone spends most of the evening observing, people naturally become curious about what they have seen. The person paused before speaking. Not dramatically. Thoughtfully. Then they said something nobody forgot. They said that every time your name came up, the conversation somehow became more hopeful. Not more complicated. More hopeful. The room fell silent. Because once those words were spoken, everyone realized they were true. No matter where the discussion had started, it always seemed to move toward possibility whenever you entered the conversation. That observation changed the emotional atmosphere immediately. It was no longer about deciding whether you belonged in the story. The discussion had evolved beyond that point. Now it was about recognizing the role you already played within it. And that realization touched everyone in the room. Because they were no longer looking at isolated moments. They were looking at a pattern. A pattern stretching across time. A pattern built from consistency, sincerity, and genuine feeling. Stay till the end. Because the final decision was now only moments away. The conversation grew quieter. Not because people had run out of things to say. Because everyone felt they were approaching something important. The kind of moment that does not need many words. One by one, final thoughts were shared. Nobody rushed. Nobody forced conclusions. Each person simply spoke from their heart. And what was remarkable was how similar those thoughts had become. Despite beginning the evening from different perspectives, they had somehow arrived at the same place. A place of understanding. A place of trust. A place of possibility. Then came the moment everyone had been waiting for. The moment when the final decision would finally be expressed. The room grew completely still. For a few seconds, nobody moved. Nobody spoke. It felt as though even time itself had paused. Then the person chosen to summarize the meeting slowly looked around the room. They could see agreement. They could see certainty. They could see something that had not been present at the beginning of the evening. Confidence. Not confidence built on assumptions. Confidence built on understanding. The person took a breath. Prepared to speak. Prepared to share the conclusion everyone had reached together. And just as the words were about to leave their lips, something unexpected happened. A new piece of information arrived. Small. Simple. Recent. Yet powerful enough to make everyone pause again. Because this new detail revealed something your soulmate had done very recently. Something they had not announced. Something they had not shared publicly. Something that revealed the true direction of their heart more clearly than any conversation ever could. And the moment that detail was revealed, every person in the room looked at one another with the exact same expression. Because suddenly they understood that the final decision they were preparing to make might already have been quietly confirmed by your soulmate's actions long before this meeting ever began.